Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Research Fellow Program series. Thank you so much for joining, those of you here in person, and also so many of you who have joined online. Clearly, this is struck a chord, so thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Venkat. I'm part of the team here at the archives at NCBS. And for those of you who have not heard of us, how is that even possible? We are a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India. And we're about 2 minutes walk in that direction in the basement of the Eastern Labs complex. Do join us if you have time later, and we'd be happy to give you a tour. One of the things that we do is we have about 350,000 objects across 60 collections and hundreds of interviews. And there is no archive without use of the archive. And so one of the things that we've been very grateful to the TNQ Foundation for is in supporting a research fellowship program and a scholar in residence program to allow and invite scholars to come and reflect on some areas of inquiry, figure out how they're going to use the collections, and then, of course, discuss their work to a public audience like yourself today. And I'm just very, very delighted to also have Parvathy, who's also been part of our team at the archives at NCBS, who took a break from her archiving to reflect on the collections that she started working on a few years ago. So I won't take more of your time, except just to introduce Parvathy to all of you. Parvathy works as an archivist, organizing and cataloging collections at the archives at NCBS to make them accessible to the public, With a background in environmental history, she has archived collections that document the intricate relationships of communities with their environment and highlight the critical narratives of environmental activism. She also tries to actively research these collections to document the histories of human landscapes. And she received the research fellowship at the archives at NCBS from April to June of 2025 to focus on research in the WPSS papers at the archives that she'll be discussing. If any of you incidentally are curious, seem to like what's going on and would like to apply for a fellowship, today is the deadline for the current call. Again, Parvathy, thanks so much for your work, and over to you.
Thank you, Venkat. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Parvathy, and I'm very excited to share the work that I've done over the past few months in the archives at NCBS as a research fellow. Over the past few months, I've been looking at the papers of a local environmental collective from Wayanad, the Wayanad Prakrithi Samrakshana Samiti. My research through these papers spans the broad themes of migration, ideas of belonging, and environmental activism. Now, why belonging? Why does it matter who belongs? What does it mean to belong to a place, especially when one is a migrant? These are the questions that lie at the heart of my research, and I approach them by looking at ideas of belonging and at how legal environmental activism becomes a form of placemaking. That is, can filing legal cases, which can be seen as such legal bureaucratic acts, technical acts, become a way of forging an identity with the place. I refer to this process as environmental placemaking. It is defined by Amrita Sen and Harini Nagendra as practices, meanings, and ideologies contributing to forging a shared identity for a place of nature as a shared socio-ecological place. Here, in the case of Wayanad, I look at how legal environmental activism is used by the community to assert their right to live, protect, and participate in the life of a place. Before diving in further, let me also position myself briefly in the work. I have a degree in history from University of Hyderabad, and I don't belong to Wayanad. I'm from Travancore in Kerala. I was deeply also interested in the migration of people from former princely state of Travancore to Malabar, a part of former Madras presidency. This movement was known as Malabar migration, and it was in search of cultivable lands between 1920s and 1960s. Earlier, I was looking at how foods like tapioca were very important for these migrant communities because it carried memories for them. Reading through it is during this time that I came into the archives at NCBS and found the papers looked at the papers of Wayanad Prakrithi Samrakshana Samiti. Reading through this collection made it increasingly clear to me how deeply the Malabar migration had affected and influenced the land use land cover change in Wayanad. And so I found myself entering the WPSS collection not just as an archivist who was processing the collection, but also as a researcher deeply interested in the history that I was archiving. Hence, I had a foot in both worlds, researching and archiving. And this presentation reflects the dual position that I had when I was entering the collection. So before I move into the research itself, I want to take a moment to set the context of how these papers came into the archives at NCBS, something that feels really important to me as an archivist. The collection was brought to the archives by Abhijit Devi, a former master's student in the Wildlife Biology and Conservation program, master's program. Having spent time at the archives and also being a member of WPSS, he strongly felt the need to preserve the histories of this largely unstructured movement. And hence, he went to the homes of individual members of WPSS and had conversations with them to donate their papers to the archives. Their collaborative effort led to the formation of the collection of WPSS at the archives. This is our catalog. Because the collection came from multiple donors, we had to respect the provenance or the origin of the records, the donors. So in the series, they are arranged according to the form of the material, and sub-series is arranged according to the people who gave the material. And in my research, I'm concentrating on the court or legal cases. And I look at how legal documents, how legal participation becomes a way for migrant communities to assert their belonging. I argue that Wayanad functions as a critical zone. Now, critical zone has multiple definitions. In earth sciences, it is the interconnected processes between the atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and geosphere, where there are multiple functions that are happening to sustain life. In environmental humanities, it's the Earth's vital habitable layer, stressing the importance of social science integration to address human-driven challenges. And in this research, I look at it as spaces where the questions of environment, migration, and citizenship intersect. And now I will look at citizenship because this forms a key analytical thread throughout my research and this presentation. Now, sociologist T.H. Marshall has defined citizenship as a status bestowed on those who are full members of a community. All those who possess the status are equal with respect to rights and duties with which the status is endowed. And now let's look at Arpita Kodiveri's definition. She has drawn upon multiple theorizations of citizenship and has outlined 3 dimensions of citizenship. The first is the legal dimension, which is concerned with the formal status of a citizen. And it goes much in tandem with what Marshall said. That is, the citizenship is defined through social, civil, and political rights. And this includes individual freedom, autonomy, and legal protection. Now, the next dimension is a procedural dimension. It focuses on how citizens participate in shaping laws, institutions, and democratic processes, whether through protest, voting, legal action, or other forms of direct participation. And the third dimension, which is very interrelated to the procedural dimension, is the identity dimension. It is related to the sense of belonging or inclusion in a collective, or the struggle to be recognized as a part of a political community. Together, these dimensions represents how the relationship between the state and the community is structured through rights, participation, and inclusion. Now, procedural and identity dimension, as I said, are quite interrelated because only when one directly participates does the state recognize. So at the risk of sounding reductionist, I would like to give a personal experience about how these 2 dimensions are interrelated. As a history graduate, when I first came into the National Center for Biological Sciences, I didn't initially feel a sense of belonging. So I had to directly, actively engage with people in the community, the NCBS community, to be recognized by the community itself. And hence, that's how I define this. That is, direct participation leads to recognition. In my research, I focus on how members of WPSS who are progeny of the migrant communities, who are mostly progeny of the migrant communities to Wayanad, engage with the procedural dimension, filing cases, participating in hearing, contesting land use decisions, and how these actions are not just about protecting the environment, but are also claims to inclusions, to being recognized as members of community. It also is crucial that I point out here that this might be a byproduct of the activism, which might not be triggering the recognition. Now, importantly, the community here doesn't also only refer to the nation state. In the context of Wayanad, the community might be local, environmental, or political, which is shaped by histories of land, migration, and environmental relationship. So when WPSS members draft legal petitions, gather environmental data, or appear before green tribunals, forest tribunals, they are not just protecting the trees or rivers, they are actively shaping the terms of their inclusion, taking a claim to this land, not only as migrant settlers, but as stewards. Now, to understand this, let's go into Wayanad. Wayanad is a mountainous district in the northern part of Kerala. And the very name Wayanad has multiple etymologies. First is Wayanad, which literally translates to forest land. The second is Vayalnad, which translates to land of the marshy lands or the land of the paddy fields, because Vayal has now come to be known as paddy fields in Kerala. And the third is the Valinad. Vali means root, and it references to its historical role in the spice trade route connecting the Western Ghats to the Arabian Sea. Now, these names reflect the region's evolving socio-economic and environmental characters, from dense forest landscape to paddy field, paddy cultivation, and pepper trade. It reflects the historical landscape of Wayanad. But this is how Wayanad looks now. This is Sultan Batheri. However, over the last century, the landscape has changed, as we have seen. In the case of Wayanad, it seems that the Malabar migration, which I referenced to earlier, has brought in most of these changes. And hence, migration is also one of the key threats that I'm analyzing throughout the research. Migrations into Wayanad began as early as 8th century, but gained momentum in the 13th century. Historically, the region was home to indigenous Adivasi communities and later came under the control of Kottayam Rajas. Over time, a series of migrations layered the region with diverse populations and land use systems. Among the earliest migrants were the Jain communities. They arrived from the Deccan Plateau, initially for trade. Their movement into Kerala began around 8th century and then gained momentum in the 13th century. They established several temples in Wayanad and between the 9th and the 14th centuries, leaving behind distinct architectural and cultural imprints. Their land acquisitions, often centered on temple economies, drove the indigenous communities towards land dispossession. Now, the next is the Chetty community, who were primarily agrarian groups from Tamil Nadu, who also migrated into Wayanad around the same time as the Jains. Their expansion also led to more land dispossession for the forest dwelling indigenous Adivasi communities. Now, the third were the Muslim traders, many of whom arrived with the Tipu Sultan's military campaigns and began settling in Wayanad as early as the 16th century. Their presence grew significantly during the Mysore regime, and these communities came from Malabar, Karnataka, and also North India, and were engaged both in cultivation and commerce. Now, Brahmins were also brought in from the Chola country during this time, marking another significant wave of migration, which was tied to state formation and temple-centered administration. Together, these groups shaped Wayanad's socio-economic landscape. As told earlier, 13th century also saw Kottayam Rajas coming into Wayanad. And Kottayam Rajas established their capital in Manandavadi, which comes from the word Maha Anandavati, which means garden of delight. And Manandavadi is in Wayanad. And the Kottayam administration, especially under Pazhashi Raja, divided the region into 10 Nad or districts, each governed by a Nair or Nambyar chiefs. This saw many Nairs and Nambyars also coming into the region. And this restructuring precipitated the land dispossession of tribal communities. Higher caste settlers, especially the Nairs and Nambyars, acquired large tracts of land, pushing Adivasi groups further into subservient roles as bonded laborers or enslaved workers. But Another transformative phase of migration happened with the British control in the region. After the Third Anglo-Mysore War in 1792, British annexed Wayanad and opened it up for plantations, mostly tea and other commercial crops. They also built roads connecting Wayanad to Talasheri and Kozhikode through Tamarasheri Ghats and Kuttiyadi Pass. Now, since the terrain was now connected to other parts of Kerala through roads, connectivity was not an issue anymore. And this meant more and more settlers pouring into Wayanad. And this migration wave came with the Grow More Food campaign during the mid-20th century, which encouraged migration from southern Kerala, mostly Travancore, into Wayanad. This was closely supported by the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church, and migrants were hence primarily Syrian Christians. These settlers extended the agricultural frontiers deep into the forest territories with minimal regulatory oversight. Forests were cleared, paddy and cash crop planted, and the ecological fabric of Wayanad began to change irreversibly. Migrants continued to arrive till the late 1960s. So by the late 20th century, Wayanad had undergone enormous transformation, as can be seen. The forest cleared, population grown, ecological systems affected. By this time, Wayanad had also become a hotspot for environmental conflict. The political conversations here often revolved around the tension between environment and development. On one hand, there were calls for ecological protection. On the other, there was demands for infrastructure, housing, and economic growth. Redpath and colleagues define these as conservation conflicts. Conservation conflicts are those which occur when two or more parties with strongly held opinions clash over conservation objectives, and one party is perceived to assert its interest at the expense of another. Now here, government agencies, tourism developers, and environmentalists are all negotiating very different visions of what the land should be and are at varying ends of the spectrum of conservation conflicts. But a broader underlying tension or stress that lies at the heart of many of these conflicts is the divide that I assume is between earlier and later migrant settlers, and how they often find themselves on opposite ends of the conservation conflict spectrum. Let me explain. Earlier migrants like the Chettis, Jains, Muslim traders, and agrarian settlers who came in from the 13th to the 19th centuries often engaged in the landscape in ways which was shaped by ritual, reverence, subsistence, and mostly temple economy-centered administration. While their arrival undoubtedly disrupted Adivasi indigenous economies and their land tenure, their relationship with the land revolved around certain ethical frameworks which were centered around temple economies and seasonal rhythms. However, the later migrants, especially those who arrived during the Grow More Food campaign or as part of the Malabar migration supported by the church, entered Wayanad under a very different paradigm. They brought with them a developmentalist worldview, one that saw forests as resources to be cultivated, cleared, and monetized. Land was less about ritual and more about utility, production, and ownership. Now, this cannot definitely not be seen in binaries or as black and white. This is just a common thread that connects these communities together. And these differences have long-term consequences, because today we see that many of these early migrants or earlier migrants or their descendants aligned with environmental groups like WPSS, and they speak of the forest as a shared moral space where they invoke care, duty, and responsibility. In contrast, some of the later settlers, especially those engaged in commercial farming, are now being cast as opponents in the conservation disputes. They often see conservation as obstruction, a barrier to development, or to securing livelihoods that depend on land conversion and infrastructure. And I would like to exemplify this through material at the archives. This is a written document by N. Badusha, and he is writing about how Wayanad should be brought back to a completely eco-friendly, toxic, chemical-free model of agriculture. As a first step, action plans must be formulated to restore the paddy fields and wetlands of Wayanad. This is also another handwritten note by Badshah, which says how he stands by his stance that the land was illegally taken from the Adivasis by migrants should be returned, and the migrants who usurp the Adivasi land are supported by the Catholic Church, which shows us how this community is viewing the later migrant communities as the enemies or as on the other end of the conservation conflict spectrum. And N. Badshah is a member of the WPSS community, and also from his oral history interviews, we come to know that he is also a descendant of people who came with the Tippu Sultan's military regime and settled in Wayanad as traders. Now, Kerala Independent Farmers Association is a farmers group mostly represented by later migrant communities who are Syrian Christian Catholic communities, And for them, their official website says how there are unjustified restrictions on their farming activities on the pretext of enforcing ecologically sensitive zone, ecologically fragile land, and ecologically sensitive area. In short, KIFA wants forest laws to be applied in forest lands only and not in the revenue lands of farmers. Moreover, KIFA would challenge and fight the forest department's continued attempt to reclassify patta lands as forests, proclaiming reasons only they are liable to respect. Now, these are posters by KIFA in their Facebook profile. This says Paristhiti Tivravadatinedire Poratam Tudarum, which literally translates to protest against environmental terrorism would continue. And by environmental terrorism, they mean the activities of the environmentalists. This is another news report that was also posted on their Facebook, which says Katal Madi Katanidi, which translates to forest laws should only be applied in forests. And this is a very stark example of where the tightrope is the buffer zone. This is forest and this is human settlement. And I guess this would give an idea of how they treat themselves as different, as on two ends of the conservation conflict spectrum. But this divide isn't just philosophical, it's also deeply historical and political. Because when later migrants arrived, especially during the Grow More Food campaign with the Malabar migration, they weren't simply seen as newcomers. They were celebrated. They were identified as progressive farmers or Purogamana Karshagar. Novels of the time construed the natives as lazy and not knowing hard work, whereas by natives here, they don't mean the Adivasi indigenous communities. The novels say the natives are the earlier settlers. And they show how the native or the earlier settler communities is alien to the ethics of hard work, while the later migrant communities are portrayed as these heroes who came to this land, to wilderness, reclaimed land from wilderness, and boosted food production, opened up forest land for cultivation, and modernized the agricultural economy. In a post-famine Kerala, 1920s to 1960s, in this post-famine Kerala, this made them indispensable. They became the face of agrarian development. And this is exactly what made it necessary for the earlier migrants to assert their legitimacy and belonging through other means. And this involved environmental care and legal activism. So the divide reflects a longer struggle over who gets to belong and in what terms. And this plays out in the legal petitions, public protests, and everyday political debates. And this is where, for me, WPSS becomes especially interesting. Because through their legal intervention, they are not just defending the forest cover, they are advancing a vision of environmental citizenship, one which is rooted in care, shared responsibility, and the belief that to protect land is to belong to it. Let me now share an example of a legal petition from WPSS. It was filed in 1983 in the High Court of Kerala against tree felling in a cardamom estate. Now, the petitioner claimed that the respondents were cutting trees in an area that they argue was not actually part of the plantation but was a vested forest. And the respondents, on the other hand, claimed that They were simply converting a cardamom plantation into a coffee estate, which involves clearing trees to allow more sunlight for coffee plants to boost production. But WPSS challenged this. They argued that the tree felling wasn't happening in the cardamom plantation at all. It was happening in an area that should have been classified as vested forest. Now, what exactly are vested forests? Vested forest is the term referring to the land that was once privately owned forest, but were brought under the government control through the Kerala Private Forest Vesting and Assignment Act of 1971. The aim of the act was to treat these forests as agricultural lands and redistribute them primarily to small farmers and agricultural laborers to boost cultivation and agricultural production in the state. So in theory, vested forests were supposed to serve agricultural purposes. But in practice, many of these lands were exploited for commercial gain, or the forest status itself was contested. In this case, WPSS was not just challenging the act of felling trees, but also the legitimacy of the respondents' claim to the land. So this is one section of the petition where they talk about the land ownership history. That is, from in the year 1951, they transferred the rights to M. Marakya Raja, and how the transfer has gone through multiple people, and how this designated land was supposed to be vested forest in the first place. So they were not just challenging tree felling, but the very claim to land ownership. This case and others like it illustrate how environmental concern and legal activism becomes tools for asserting rights, contesting claims, and shaping the future of the region. Another striking feature of the petitions, and more like it, is how it invokes the idea of fundamental duty. As we all know, fundamental duties listed in Article 51A of the Constitution are non-enforceable, meaning we aren't legally bound to fulfill them, unlike the fundamental rights. Yet what's interesting here is that the petitioners, who are members of the WPSS, use these duties as moral and constitutional anchor for their activism. They repeatedly cite their fundamental duty to protect and improve the natural environment as laid out in Article 51AG of the Constitution. The petition also highlights how the respondents failed to do their duty. That is, here the respondents are Union of India and the state of Kerala. They have failed to exercise their constitutional and statutory duties to prevent deforestation and environmental degradation. So what WPSS is doing here is really interesting. They are positioning themselves as citizens fulfilling their constitutional duty, while also asking the court to hold the state accountable to direct the first four respondents to carry out their statutory and constitutional duty to protect the forest. Now let's look more closely at the petition itself, the framing of the petition. That is, the first four respondents are Union of India, State of Kerala, District Collector, Taluk Land Board, and then are the land owners themselves named as respondents. Even though the case appears to be about tree felling in a private estate, these land owners are the people who are felling trees, but still the initial respondents seem to be Union of India and State of Kerala. This is important because it shows WPSS wasn't just challenging the illegal tree felling by private actors, they were also holding the state accountable for its failure to regulate and protect land. In their eyes, government was not just a bystander, it was a party responsible for inaction. In this way, the petition functions on two levels: challenges the individual violations by the landowners, and also calls out the state's systemic failure to prevent environmental harm. This dual framing is crucial because it shifts the petition from just being a local protest to being a constitutional one. And this is how we see environmental activism becoming something much more: a way of practicing citizenship, a way of demanding transparency, and a way of participating in governance. In that sense, the petition is not just a legal document, but a powerful expression of what I referred to earlier as environmental placemaking. Now let's move to another petition that was filed by the WPSS in the National Green Tribunal in 2014. And this was against illegal construction activities happening in the Kerala Veterinary and Animal Sciences University near Pookod Lake in Wayanad, which is an ecologically sensitive area. And just like what we saw in the 1983 case, the structure of respondents in the petition is worth noting. First is the Union of India, second is the State of Kerala, then additional Chief Secretary to Government, Revenue Department, and the final is the Kerala Veterinary and Animal Sciences University. Why is this important? Because WPSS is repeating a legal strategy that they had used earlier. They're not just framing environmental degradation as a result of local private actors. They are saying this is a failure of governance. So what exactly is this case about? It is about the challenge, the petitioner's challenging the university's use of 100 acres of land that the petitioners argue is actually notified vested forest land. Vested forest lands came to be under government control through the Kerala Private Forest Vesting and Assignment Act of 1971, which we saw earlier. In this case, WPSS argues that the land in question in the Kunnatidavada village was notified as vested forest in 1977. But what happened? Over the years, parts of this land was allocated to tribal welfare schemes like the Pookota Girijan Collective Farming Cooperative Society. Unfortunately, due to the failure of these schemes, the land was shuffled between departments, and eventually the 100 acres were handed over to the university for new construction. But here's the critical part. The transfer didn't go through the required approval processes under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. Now, the Supreme Court of India had also ruled that no construction on forest land can happen without prior approval from central government. And yet, according to the petitioners, WPSS, construction began without clearance and in clear violation of both national law and Supreme Court precedent. But the petition goes even further. It tells us that this land includes Shola forest and grassland, an endemic ecosystem restricted to southern Western Ghats. It is in steep erosion-prone hills. It has a fragile geo-ecological balance, and it is an ecologically sensitive area. So it's not just a technical violation. It's a threat to unique, irreplaceable landscape. And here's where the constitutional framing comes in again. The petition accuses the state of enabling what they call a fraud on constitutional governance. And it is facilitating illegal development while also displacing land rights and destroying fragile ecologies. Let's take a moment to reflect on what's at stake here. This is not just about trees. This is not just about construction. It's about legal and moral boundaries of state power in places like Wayanad. Because what the petition reveals is that land meant for tribal development was diverted for institutional expansion. Forest laws were ignored or bypassed. Environmental degradation was justified in the name of progress. And through this all, what civil society like WPSS is doing is using legal activism as a form of citizenship. The construction went ahead, although there was a stay by the National Green Tribunal. The construction went ahead after the former Chief Minister Ummanchandi wrote to the Ministry of Environment and Forest. Now, there is also another tension that emerges throughout this, which is WPS's position in a different incident, the Muttanga incident. In 2003, Adivasi families, frustrated by years of broken land right promises, entered the Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary to reclaim what they saw as their rightful land. In response, the state sent in police. The result was a violent clash, and one Adivasi man was killed and several others injured. And the entire episode became a national symbol of the state's betrayal of indigenous rights. Now, here's the critical part. WPSS condemned the Adivasi action. They argued that since this was a wildlife sanctuary, settlement could not be allowed. Even if the Adivasis had been failed by the state, ecological and legal boundaries they insisted had to be respected. This position stands very much in line with the legal mechanisms that they're using. They weren't ready to challenge the legal boundaries of the sanctuary or the state. So what does this tell us? The WPSS activism stands in a complex ethical space. At times, they champion forest rights, forest conservation over community rights, and at other times, they invoke Adivasi entitlement to challenge state-led development. They aren't always consistent. They choose different framings, constitutional and moral, depending on the context. And this makes this story not just one of environmental defense, but of a contested terrain of justice itself in places like Wayanad. It raises important questions of who gets to speak for the environment, the forest. When do conservation values align with social justice and when do they diverge? What happens when the same land is seen simultaneously as ecologically sacred, legally protected, historically stolen? These aren't easy questions, but the WPSS petitions, complex, strategic, and sometimes contradictory, brings them to the surface. Because ultimately, legal activism here isn't just about trees or laws. It's about navigating the fragile and politically charged relationship between land, rights, and responsibility. Let me take you to one final case, which was filed by WPSS in 2019. This was against ecotourism. Ecotourism at first glance seems like a good idea. Responsible travel, minimal impact, local benefit. But what the petition shows is a very different picture. Construction without clearance, plastic waste inside forests, and permanent infrastructure in protected areas without any study about the carrying capacity. Once again, the WPSS doesn't just say stop it. They say you already have guidelines. You already have a policy by the Kerala Forest Department. You even have a proper draft plan. So why did you withdraw it, or why are you diluting it? They demand that the original policy be reinstated, and that's the key. They are not asking the court to make new law or new policies. They are asking the state to implement the guidelines which had already been approved and then quietly ignored. And this is the final point I want to make. They are using right to information. Right to information is also a commonly known way of asserting citizenship. They are using right to information to gather evidence for the case against ecotourism. Now, all these cases are following a common grammar. All these three petitions that I've been talking about follow common grammar. They invoke constitutional duty, rely on RTI as a tool of citizenship, call upon both the union and state to act, and push for the implementation of policy guidelines. There are more examples in the WPSS archives, from a 1985 plaint asking the government to fill elephant traps that were dug, to petitions against illegal land grants under Forest Rights Act, to efforts to ban night traffic on roads going through the sanctuaries. And each of these petitions follow the same pattern. And each of them show how law is being used not just to demand justice, but to perform responsibilities. So in the end, what we see is not just environmental litigation. We see the crafting of a citizen, an environmental citizen, someone who doesn't wait for the state to act, but who engages the law, uses rights, and upholds constitutional duties and demand that the state do the same. But this is not just it. They also exercise their citizenship through other democratic mechanisms like filing memorandums. For instance, they wrote directly to the Prime Minister of India about a tree felling happening in a private estate, the Meenakshi plantation. This was on a private estate, but close to a landslip-prone Ghat road. Their argument was that even if the land is privately owned, the government must intervene because it is the interest of the larger society which is at stake. And that's a crucial shift, expanding the domain of environmental concern beyond legal ownership and pushing for action based on public ecological risk. In short, they do not simply fight for nature, they perform a kind of participatory citizenship. And this is what I've been calling environmental placemaking all along. Through their legal actions, WPSS members are not just protecting forests, they are staking a claim to Wayanad's future. They are saying through these petitions that we are not migrants, we are not outsiders, we care for this land, and we have a right to shape what happens here. In this way, every petition becomes an act of belonging, a declaration of place-based citizenship, and yet this position is not without contradiction as the one we saw in the Muthanya case. What remains consistent is how WPS is the effort of WPSS to build a new kind of political community. Their tools like petitions, RTIs, memorandums begin to construct what Benedict Anderson had referred to as imagined community. Anderson defined the nation as a socially constructed imagined political community. Imagined because not because it's not real, but even though its members never will meet each other, never all of them will never meet each other, they will feel a deep horizontal sense of shared belonging. And that's exactly what we are seeing here. An environmental public slowly coming into existence, one that imagines itself through shared duties to the land, forest, and wildlife. And they share an ethic similar to the earlier migrant communities. So what do we see really in the work of WPSS? Not just litigation, not just protest, but the crafting of an environmental citizen. Now, before concluding, I would also like to take a moment to say that Wayanad is the district in Kerala with the highest Adivasi population. So today what I have attempted to do is not a study of the Adivasi indigenous population. I have not attempted to study the land dispossession, and certainly this is not a study based on their experiences, who historically have been the most affected by all the conflicts in the region. I want to explicitly acknowledge that my work is based on the papers of an environmental collective, WPSS, which notably does not include Adivasi voices or representation. Therefore, I have not commented on Adivasi experiences of dispossession because to do so without direct engagement or community-led sources would be irresponsible of me. While it is evident that the Adivasi communities have borne the brunt of conservation conflicts in the region, I believe that any meaningful commentary on their experiences must come from a thorough, sustained engagement with the communities themselves, their oral histories, and the sources created by them. I have conducted a very preliminary field-based survey, but I do not yet have the grounding in terms of sources or understanding to speak about Adivasi land dispossession with the depth it requires. I do hope to expand the scope of my research in the future to engage with this crucial dimension more respectfully and collaboratively. Now, I would like to thank a lot of people, and this is going to take a while. My team at Archives at NCBS, who have listened to, I think, more than 3 mocks of this presentation. Thank you for giving your inputs, your suggestions. Thank you, Datri, for listening to random popping of ideas. Thank you, Venkat, for always checking it with me every week, and all the others whose name I have not taken, but I am really thankful to. The members of WPSS, all of who are not present in this picture, but for kindly donating their papers, N. Badusha, Thomas Ambalavayal, Manoj Uncle, Abdul Wahab, PM Suresh, everyone, and CC Matthew, who is not anymore part of the collective, but still has his papers at the archives at NCBS. Thank you so much. Manoj Uncle, Shirley Auntie, Achaman, Abhijit for opening their homes whenever I was in Wayanad. My family, who were with me through thick and thin, and my grandfather, who would be absolutely proud of me for doing this today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Parvathy. And I guess we're open for questions, and we have one right here.
Hi, Parvathy. Thank you for concluding with what you did. I was just wondering which Adivasi groups are indigenous to Wayanad?
There are pioneers. I'm not very familiar with all the groups. I should be, but I am not quite familiar.
Okay. Is such an information like difficult to?
It's not. There are. I think I'm too tense right now, and that's why I'm not getting it. There are pioneers for sure because I have interacted with them. There are cartoonaicas. Yeah. Kuruma, yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I was just curious.
Just one logistical note. If you're speaking, just we'll have the mic come over to you so that it can be recorded. There's a question here, and I think there's a question at the back.
Thank you. There is a museum in Ambalavayal.
Yes.
And Palasiraja in Manandavadi.
Yeah.
Can you correlate that with your presentation?
The museum in Wayanad is the Wayanad Heritage Museum. It was we also have materials related to the Wayanad Heritage Museum in the archives. Wayanad Heritage Museum was a result of the archaeological excavations that were conducted in the region by MGS Narayanan, Raghava Warrior, and a lot of others who were also doing this as a collaborative effort with the WPSS. And this were mostly megalithic excavations. So it was much before in time than when the migrations were happening.
Regarding Palasiraja.
Sorry, I didn't get
Palasiraja.
Palasiraja, yeah.
He was in that region.
Yeah, he was in the region 18th century, much after that. Yeah. Oh, do you want me to talk more about Palasiraja?
A little, whatever you can. If you can.
I am not.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, we can talk after this about him.
One last question.
Indeed.
There are two major dams. The Kabini River gets all its water from the Wayanad rainfall. One dam is there in Banasura Dam. Another one is Karapula Dam. Does it affect the environment, ecosystem in that location?
I think all dams do affect the ecosystem that it is located in, but I guess the ecologist would be able to tell you more about how it affects rather than me, a historian. Yeah.
Thank you. Last, not a question, information. The only honey museum in India is located near Wayanad. Near Katapana, that Kalpeta.
Okay.
Only honey museum in whole India.
Okay.
Parvathy, I have to say this was such a rich and enlightening presentation, and your analysis goes in so many different directions that I really feel there is scope for so much work here that you've laid out for us. And I'm really amazed that you managed to pack it all into a short presentation. So there's many things that I'd like to discuss with you, perhaps later, some of the things that come out. But one of the ways that to me, the argument seems that WPSS is engaged in the kind of forging of this environmental citizenship, right? Even though that has its own contradictions and that has its own tensions. And that environmental citizenship is located, as you did so beautifully, in this moment and this sort of continuing zone, as it were, of environmental conflict. Now, one of the ways to think about social movements, and there's a huge amount of sociological literature on social movements, is to think about the interests that are served by the creation of that social movement, right? To kind of think about it quite instrumentally as why that a movement or a grouping of people is created in order to serve the interests of that particular group. And those in South Asia might be caste interests, or might be community interests, might be professional interests, etc. Another way to think about that, and I think you're pushing us towards that, is to think, to kind of consider a group like the KPSS as acting not just in their own interests, but in the interests of something larger than that. Then in some ways in acting selflessly, acting in an altruistic way in the service of a constitutional duties, but also in terms of sort of creating a new space, as it were, for what an environmental citizenship might look like. And I find that a very appealing prospect, and I love that you're doing that. But there is the cynical part of me that also wants to know a little more about the interests that are served by the group. So could you tell us a little bit about the group itself, when it was formed, who its members are, what kind of social, political, economic interests they represent, and whether you see any tensions within those as they kind of generate this kind of environmental citizenship?
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Ghazala, you can take it, and then if you don't mind, just pass the mic to the person next to you.
Thanks, Parvathy. That was really interesting. I was wondering, I mean, to add on to Samira's question, actually, she got me thinking about, questions about how widespread the movement was that was triggered by WPSS. And what was their kind of influence? What was their environmental constituency really in the public constituency rather? So, perhaps the material on the protests would be better suited to answer that.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering if you can tell us something about how influential it was, because it seems like, from what you've said, it seems like a small community of men who are very concerned about some very specific issues, but it's probably just the material that you have used so far. But did it translate to a very wide constituency across that district? That's my question.
Thank you, Ghazala. I don't think it did influence the public imagination as something like the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad did, because WPSS also was a result of the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad movement, the Save Silent Valley movement, which influenced the public imagination a lot. And hence, there were movements like these that took existence or that took birth in different parts of Kerala. And in Wayanad, the Wayanad Prakrithi Samrakshana Samiti, I don't think it captured the public imagination as much, but it still continues to exist. And it still continues to organize protests, organize workshops, organize seminars, bringing in scientists, ecologists, environmentalists from different parts of Kerala in order to talk about different issues that the region is facing. But it is a really small constituency, as you said rightly.
Sorry, can I just... Sorry, I think the connection with KSSP is really interesting, because the KSSP was responsible for very wide-ranging sort of movements, and also they had a huge, following within.
Yes.
So that, I think that part is really interesting to me. Thank you.
Hi, my question can be a bit out of context, just curious. So all these association, as you said, like the Adivasis won the burnt, and this is a long battle. So any of these association or the public or any private companies, anyone came forward to lift the Adivasis? Are they integrated into the society? Like education cannot wait. So this is a long battle. So any idea, like where do they stand?
Where do they stand is a much bigger question, I feel, that I'm not equipped to answer. There are movements that represent the Adivasis of the region. Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, which was the movement that brought Adivasis together during the Muthanya incident, is an organization that does work for the Adivasis, and it is through Adivasi representation that they do it. It is not a top-down approach, I would say. It is a very community-centered approach, but I'm not familiar with other organizations doing such work. There is also AKS, which is also doing similar work, but I am not familiar with other organizations.
Thank you. This is another out of context question. So you said there were some different communities that migrated from different parts of India. Just curious, do they speak the local language, or do they carry their own language, what they've migrated?
It's Malayalam.
It's Malayalam completely, because it's been centuries back. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that talk. I don't know how much of a question this is, but I'm just wondering how much of a role literacy plays in this form of, asserting your citizenship or right to land. Because you're saying the earlier migrants were the Jains, Chettis, Brahmins, Nayars, and Nambiyars. So did literacy itself play a large role in this mode of asserting the citizenship?
Literacy does play a role. It is, as I said, thank you for the question. Sorry, thank you for the question. I would say yes, literacy does play a role. And that is the question I raised in one of my later slides about how who gets to speak for the environment is decided by such factors like literacy. And being in a certain section of the society, the privileges that come associated with where you are on the social ladder decides who gets to speak for nature and environment and forests. That's what I would say.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I don't know if I'm not sure if we've discussed this, but I'm curious, what is the perspective of the members of the WPSS organization of your take on how they're going about this? I mean, the strategy of citizenship. You're inferring citizenship through the petitioner's documents, but are there also documents or interviews or conversations where they have said this is what we need to do? I'm just curious to know what their take on this is.
This is my inference of what they are trying to do. They have never in any context openly said that this is what they are trying to craft citizenship, or they are trying to craft environmental citizenship. It's not something they have said explicitly. This is my reading of the documents of what they are trying to do. And I hope everyone from WPSS has joined and I hope they give me feedback on what I've tried to do.
Sorry, I'm also playing double role. There is a question, one last question, I think, from the audience online from Maitri, and I'm just quoting. Following up on the previous question, did the archives or your own exploration of the archives give a hint as to why WPSS chose this route for activism, the legal route, that is, of filling petitions, etc.? I guess it's slightly related. I don't know if you can take a shot at that.
This is not just the route they have chosen. They have chosen multiple forms of activism. They also do public protests. They also organize workshops and seminars, as I said. And this is not the only route they have chosen. They have also chosen it as one of their routes to doing activism. And I guess that does answer the question.
Thank you.
Thanks. So carrying on from my preoccupation with science, I'm wondering how much of science was playing a role in the activism. They seem to be pretty knowledgeable and up to date about certain research and knowledge about ecosystems and ecosystem functions and things like that. So I'm wondering whether the members of WPSS, if any of them were naturalists or had connections with scientists, or they had scientists advising them in any way. Just a random question, because it's really interesting, because in the case of Kerala, that there is a history to that. So yeah, thanks.
Most of the members were farmers. They were not trained scientists. Some of them are naturalists. But they were in constant contact with scientists like Satish Chandran Nair, P.K. Uttaman are all trained scientists, and they were in constant touch with them. They were constantly engaging with them, and they have been organizing these workshops, calling in scientists to talk about different issues so that they can also gain knowledge about what's happening.
It's very interesting. Thanks.
Since you mentioned it, I thought it was important to bring this in. I'm Abhijit, and my father is also part of the collective. Like you mentioned, it is a loosely held organization. It's like people coming together when something happens. It's not like they don't have a fundraising office or anything like that. And many a times when they needed information, they had networks to reach out to people like P.K. Uttaman, who they still call as their guide, like whenever they wanted information, because in 1970s, there was a huge protest against forest department's action to plant eucalyptus in grasslands back then. So if you look at the documentation, they still have written about how grasslands can't be considered as wastelands back then in 1970s. So it's a huge network, might not be as recognized as KSSP, like you mentioned, but these were also one of the first members of KSSP because of their ideological conflicts as to how they are diluting certain stands to take sides of political figures back then. They're like, we don't want to be associated with any political figures, and they formed their independent organization. That's the birth of the, just giving you.
Thanks, Ghazala. Thanks, Abhijit, for contextualizing and broadly for making this donation possible as well. So please send the word to all the folks at WPSS. And let's all give a big hand to Parvathy. Thank you so much.